Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 6, Sensation, Perception, and Action. I'm your host tonight, Dr. Daniel Fisher. We're going to cover all the news and all the comings and goings of psychology, Chapter 6, in this course today. So let's get into it. Two sides of the same coin, sensation and perception. Sensation is a detection of physical energy by our sense organs, which send that information to the brain. Perception is the brain's interpretation of the raw sensory data. Perspectives on perception. Constructivists, they are a nurture theory of perception. Perceptions are constructed over time through learning. Understanding the input coming in through senses requires interacting with the environment and figuring out what sensations mean. Nativists, which is a nature theory, they argue that their innate capabilities and maturation programs drive perceptual development. Perception does not require interpretation. So we're debating here the level by which interpretation and interacting with the environment impacts perception. Gibson's ecological theory of perception. Nature nurtures are inseparable, considers how the environment is organized. So this person says, hey, wait a second, what if both matter? Information important for perception is readily and directly valuable in the environment. Do not need past learning experiences with the object. All the information needed to interpret current perceptual situations is available in the current situation. Features of the objects directly reveal its affordances, what it has to offer us, and how it might be used by us. If a ball is thrown at your face, you move because light bouncing off the ball, which reaches eye, gives us enough information to move. Perception drives action. Whew. All right, so basically the point here is that both matter, and we are able to interpret the stimulus based on the characteristics of that stimulus. We don't need learning necessarily with it. We can stare at it, and we can kind of interpret some attributes of that stimulus that allows us to perceive it. And again, the features of that stimulus directly reveals its affordances, what it's to offer, and how it might be used by us. We look at it, we're able to kind of piece together, what is this thing, how do we use it? So it's our kind of our natural instinct, a biological innate process, combined with the features of an item within an environment that allows us to perceive items. Methods for assessing infant perception. We have habituation, which is a process of responding less strongly over time to repeated stimuli, measures how long until an infant becomes bored, how quickly a new stimulus captures an infant's attention. So we just hold up my cell phone and we just look at how long this baby will stare at it, or how many times I go like this in front of the baby's eyes, how often we'll look at it before it becomes bored. Preferential looking, I use eye tracking to determine which object an infant prefers to look at. So you hold up two different items, the new PlayStation 5 or Bob the Builder. And if the infant may want to look at Bob the Builder more because the PS5 is a tank looking object that's not interesting. So you can actually track a infant's preference by using eye tracking technology, which literally tells you exactly where on an item an infant is looking and for how long down to the millisecond. Evoke potentials measure electrical activity from the brain by placing electrodes on babies' heads. So that's kind of like what you see at the top of the screen. You just put sets of like electrical monitors, electrons on a child's skull, and those electrons are able to pick up electrical currency being released by your brain when it's working, when it's functioning. And based on that, you can and say you have like 1,000 of those electrons on a baby's skull, you can then look at say electron number 900, and say electron number 900 is in the motor cortex, and say that electrode number 900 is very active during whatever task. So then you can infer that that brain area, the motor cortex, is involved more while performing this task. It's not a direct, you're not actually measuring the brain directly. You're not seeing the brain, but rather electrical activities, and then kind of correlating that with brain regions based on where we know the layout of the brain. Operate conditioning, learning controlled by consequences of the organism's behavior. Once response is well established, researchers can examine the conditions under which infants will and won't continue to produce the behavior. So you basically just condition a child to act a certain way. So move their leg, which makes the merry-go-round go around, and you look at how long or will a kid figure that out, and then you can see if the child will produce that behavior after a week of not working with the merry-go-round or if distracted by another object, etc. So they learn a behavior, and then you see how and under which conditions a child will perform that behavior. Vision. How does it work? Eye takes in stimulation in the form of light. The human visible spectrum is a narrow band of light that we respond to. Other animals may have more restricted or a broader spectrum. So some animals can see more colors than we can, and some can see less. The brain converts light into electrical chemical signals to the brain, or I should say the eye does that. And from the first minutes of life, a newborn can detect changes in brightness and visually track a slow-moving picture or object. So pretty straightforward. Now let's see what an infant can see. Visual acuity, which is the ability to perceive detail, at birth 40 times worse than adult, improves to 2120 vision in first month, still pretty rough, which is the equivalent of a giant E on the top of a vision chart. Vision is blurry unless within 1 feet of the infant. So if you're across the room and you're making noises or whatever, that kid is not seeing who the hell you are unless you get within pretty close to them. Visual accommodation, ability of the lens of the eye to change shape to bring objects at different distances into focus. This develops with age, and it may be one mechanism by which vision improves. Continuing on with what infants can see, color vision is present at birth, cannot discriminate some color differences, sense receptors of retina not yet mature. So a biological reason why they cannot see as many colors as they can as an adult. Newborns can perceive light and dark objects, see simple patterns, and focus on nearby objects. Organization, the world of objects. Perception is organized. First challenge for the infant is to separate the visual field into distinct objects. Where does one object end and the other begin? This may seem simple now, but say you have two heads, a mother and father putting their heads together to look at the baby. This kid is trying to figure out, okay, where is my father and where is my mother? Form perception changes. 1-month-olds focus on the outer contours of forms, such as faces. 2 months explore the interiors of figures thoroughly. So again, with eye tracking technology, you can see exactly where an infant is looking and for how long, and then track that developmentally. Organization, the world of objects. Continuing on. Infants are sensitive to cues about the wholeness of objects, particularly object movement. Determines where an object begins and ends. 4-month-olds use common motion as a cue. Expect all parts of the object to move in the same direction at the same time. 6-month-olds can determine the boundaries of edges of stationary objects. So we see an improvement of the ability to determine where one object begins and one ends, but it occurs kind of in a continuous factor or stage factors, depending on your theory. But the easier the boundary is, aka if it's stationary, it's easier to tell where an object begins and ends versus if a object is moving. And infants understand, as stated, that if my phone is moving across the screen this way, it's not going to split in half randomly and go 2 different directions. Infant visual processes, contour, which is a large amount of light, dark transition, sharp boundaries between light and dark. Soft colors are difficult for infants to see. Displays are dynamic or contain movement. Infants can track movement. And patterns that are moderately complex, something that isn't boring but isn't too complex. So that beautiful sweet spot. Vision cliff. So this is an experiment you can see here that There's a glass floor, and it kind of looks like it's a cliff. And you ask the child to walk towards their mother or father or caregiver, going across that fake cliff and see if the child will do so. Most infants of crawling age clearly perceive depth and are afraid of drop-offs. 6.5-month-old babies, 27 out of 36 infants would not cross. So this is kind of the data from this seminal original study of this. But other researchers have argued that infants may not actually fear the cliff. Infants explore the edges of the cliff without any distress, and avoidance of drop-off is stronger in infants who have crawled/felled. So in a kind of an environmental influence of this cliff study. So there are replication issues, as stated, and people call into question the interpretation of the original study and this experience factor. So if your child is constantly smashing their face onto the ground while trying to develop, trying to learn how to walk/crawl, they are maybe more fearful of the prospect of falling off a cliff than a child who has maybe been more successful crawling or walking. Intuitive theories come equipped with organized systems of knowledge which allow them to make sense of the world. 6-month infants seem surprised when a ball is dropped behind a screen and not at the bottom of a platform. 4-month-old infants possibly suspect a ball entering from the left side of an object to reappear on the right side. So all this is saying is that the infant, and the argument here is that there's kind of an innate ability for infants to recognize, at least by, or, well, there's an argument of how innate disability is, how much learning is required to learn disability. But the task is, if you drop a ball behind a platform, and then you pick up that platform and the ball isn't there, the child may seem surprised, which is measured by staring at the place where the ball should be. Ah, the ear. We love to see it, don't we, folks? This is a lot less complicated than vision. We're really kind of like a motor process here. Let's jump into it. Hearing more developed than vision at birth, preterm babies may be at risk for later attention and language problems due to underdeveloped auditory systems. So if you remember kind of the charts in the beginning of this class where different organs are developing prenatally at different rates and at different time periods, well, some researchers argue that preterm babies are at risk for attention problems and language problems because their auditory system was not fully developed prenatally. So that manifests behaviorally and like through cognitive language development and attention slash self-regulation. It manifests in those behaviors in a negative way. So it reduces attention abilities and may be harmful to language development. How does hearing work? Moving air molecules enter the ear and cause the eardrum to vibrate. Vibrations transmitted to the cochlea in the inner ear, converted to electrical signals that the brain interprets as sounds. Preterm infants who are exposed to womb-like sounds in neonatal intensive care units develop larger auditory cortex than preterm infants who listen to standard sounds. So this is kind of the first bullet point and third bullet point, kind of matching up here. And it kind of speaks to a similar point. So a preterm baby, maybe having an underdeveloped auditory cortex, and one way to accelerate that growth postnatally would be to expose an infant to sounds that they would have heard in the womb, some studies have found. Infant hearing preferences. Young infants show a preference for speech over non-speech sounds. Newborns recognize vowel sounds from their native language they were exposed to in the womb. Researchers gave newborn pacifiers fitted with sensors connected to a computer, then delivered auditory stimuli, which sucked. Infants in the foreign language group sucked on the pacifiers more than infants in the familiar language group. Humans are biologically capable of learning any language with development. They become more sensitive to their own language. At 7 months of age, children show no difference in brain activity in response to sounds from infants' native language. At 11 and 12 months of age, infants show greater activity to their native language. So the key points here are that humans are social creatures. We are mammals, and we like to hear speech. We like communicating. So it's not just that we want to hear some sounds. Is I want to hear the sounds of humans, and typically for the infants, it's the sounds of their family, their parents, their caregivers. And we see specialization here. So humans are capable of learning any language, but as they're exposed to more to the language of their household, they begin to specialize in that language. So, and you notice this at a neurological level, where you see certain brain activity related to uh, playing sounds in their native language, so increased neural activity for sounds played in their own language versus sounds played in their non-native language. And they have a preference for their native language because so one study found that, as detailed, that if you give a newborn pacifier and teach them that by sucking on the pacifier, they will release auditory stimuli in a language, and the infants in the foreign language group sucked on their pacifiers more than infants in the familiar language group. And suggests that there's kind of a novelty effect. So the infant, these researchers argue, are interested in this new language, and they're, kind of that bored effect with their native language. So they're like saying, "Oh, wow, this is a sound I've never heard before. This is interesting. So I want to hear more of it." Infant taste. Babies can distinguish sweet, bitter, and sour taste at birth. They show a preference for sweets. Flavor preferences are highly responsive to learning. Eating the food makes us appreciate it more. Greater exposure to a variety of flavors during infancy may lead to more adventuresome later life eating. And we see this throughout a lot of things in this book. Early behaviors it predicts and is associated with later behavior. Obviously, there are a lot of prenatal, or sorry, I should say postnatal factors that go into eating habits or anything really. But the kind of the takeaway here is that your adult behaviors do not come out of nowhere. They are associated with previous behaviors, a number of previous behaviors that interact over time, and from which your later life behaviors develop. Infant smell. Infants turn away from vinegar smells. They prefer the smell of their own amniotic fluid. Suggests olfactory cues are detectable prenatally. Exposure to familiar smells can calm newborns when caregivers are away, and infants and mothers can recognize their mothers by smell, suggests smell helps babies and parents get to know each other. Pretty straightforward here. All right, let's look at temperature and pain. Premature babies who are systematically stroked over their entire body gain more weight, more relaxed, more regular sleep patterns. So touch matters for development. Newborns are sensitive to warmth, cold, and pain. Pain is responsive to learning. Infants who have already had their heels pricked show a larger response to having blood drawn than infants who have never had it done before. So pretty straightforward. The infant sees that little prick, like a needle coming towards their heel for the first time, and they have no idea what's going on. But that second time, they've learned that there's going to be a little bit of pain, and they are more likely to they cry or be upset about that approaching needle. Influences on early perceptual development. Kittens deprived of normal visual experiences result in a lack of neural connections between the eye and visual cortex. Multiple hypothesized sensitive periods during which vision can be influenced by experience. Normal developed vision will develop if exposed to normal visual input, will not occur if input absent. Damage. Absent visual inputs is likely to lead to permanent deficits. Recovery, visual system has the potential to recover. Infants with cardiacs perform worse on emotion reading tasks as an adult and visual tasks if not removed by 10 weeks of age. So what are we looking at here? Our key points. Our first one is that there are these experimenters here that said, hey, what if we just made kittens blind by depriving them of vision? And not surprisingly, when they did so, there was a damage but that was evident within their brain. So you can look at kittens' brains and you can say, oh, wait, now they're, just make something up, visual cortex is now atrophied 20%. So, hey, not having normal visual experiences harms parts of the brain that associated with vision, or really specialize in it. And even after you restored vision in the kittens, that areas of their brain that atrophy did not recover, would suggest a critical period. AKA, if you don't have that sensory input within that period of time, it will never develop. But humans typically don't have critical periods. They're more known as sensitive periods, which we talked about in previous lectures. And a sensitive period is just increased susceptibility during a particular stage, increased risk, increased change during a certain time period. So it's similar, kind of a similar idea here that if input is absent during X amount of months, or sorry, I should say X amount of weeks for a newborn baby, they will have lifelong permanent deficits in their vision. You need environmental inputs, that environmental stimuli to secure the your full developmental potential for vision. So again, this is kind of this environmental impact on vision, and which is permanent. Depending on how long that stimuli is withheld from the child. Other parts of the brain will try and adapt to that, to the damage of the visual cortex, but they're still visually impaired. Sleeper effects, what that refers to is that certain behaviors of humans will not manifest for decades, for years later. So for example, if you have issues with calculus, you can't really measure the calculus abilities in a 3-year-old, but maybe there's some kind of rudimentary mathematical ability that is related to future calculus ability. Well, in this case, specifically with vision, if an infant has cardiacs and is not removed by 10 weeks of age, they have lower emotion reading skills because they're unable from day one, they're unable to see the world or see less of the world than typically infants would. So therefore, they see less faces, and therefore they're less kind of socialized, or they're not receiving as many social cues, or not interacting within their social world, which has harmful developmental effects. Locomotion in the child. Locomotion is a vital aspect of development. Movement from one place to another allows for engagement with the environment and access to new environments/affordances. Infants acquire gross motor skills before mastering fine motor skills, kicking legs versus writing the alphabet, and follows the principles that we talked about earlier in the chapter. Myelination between neurons of the brain and muscles follow head to tail, and activities involving the trunk are mastered before leg activities. So our takeaways here is that motor movement is critical on its own, but movement allows a child to interact with the world. They learn more, they play with more things, it's just more experiences that allows for cognitive and social growth. They master, as I said, just kind of just rough movements before very precise movements, so alphabets, for example, and then myelination plays a key role in increased motor movement ability. Motor skills as dynamic action systems. Infants move their bodies in repetitive ways, bouncing, rocking to learn new behavior. They engage in rhythmic stereotypes before a new skill emerges, but not after skill is established. Infants engage in rhythmic stereotypes before new skills learned. Dynamic systems theory development takes place through a self-organizing process. Children use sensory feedback when trying different movements. Okay, so our takeaways here is that infants develop movements kind of along a qualitative or a quantitative shift. So they're gradually going up that hill of motor movement. They're moving, they're bouncing around, and that kind of serves as a prerequisite to more precise movements. And that's evident because once an infant learns a precise movement, they tend to lessen or not use that previous rhythmic movement because they found a new efficient way to move. And for dynamic systems theory, all we're getting at here is that children have an understanding of where their body is in time and space, and they adapt based on their motor behavior and in the environment around them. So this slide is just reiterating what I already stated, and that's behaviors in a moment of time are cumulative effects of motor decisions made across the life, not random. So when a child is rhythmically rocking, moving their arms around, they're kind of practicing or building the abilities to perform more precise movements. The action systems and dynamic action systems theorists argue that toddlers walk because they learn that walking works well given their biomechanical properties and environments they interact with. Feedback from senses, nature, nurture, interacting. So toddlers develop increased motor skills, and then they interact with things, and they're like, "Oh, this is man, I'm having a grand old time. I'm now just screwing up everything in this house, and I love it. So I'm going to keep doing this. I'm going to get better at walking." So kind of nature nurture interacting. Researchers found toddlers could adjust their walking to changes in both their body dimensions, slope of a walkway. So the idea here is that the infant is aware of their body movements and they're aware of the environments and they will adapt, as the previous bullet point said on the other slide. Integrating sensory informations. Brain integrate pieces of information from the environment into a coherent single coherent understanding. Newborns will look in the direction of sound as the brain develops the ability to consider multiple pieces of sensory information and past experiences to better understand the meaning of multiple sources of input improves. Cross-modal perception, recognize through one sense an object familiar with through another, difficult for newborns to determine what objects are in a bag through touch alone. So all this is saying is that as you gain more experience in the world, if I was to drop my a glass plate on the ground and it shatters, everybody in the house is going to know, oh damn, this idiot just broke some glass in the house, even though they didn't see the glass break, because they understand that sound is associated with glass breaking, aka that physical breaking. Newborns don't have that ability yet partially because they don't have that experience seeing a glass fall. And they don't have the ability to consider multiple pieces of sensory information at the same time. Attention, focusing on perception and cognition on something in particular. We have an orienting system, which reacts to events in the environment, and a focusing system, deliberately seeks out and maintains attention to events. So kind of just straightforward here. One, is able to just pay attention, ignore events, and the other one reacts to events in the environment. So what attention improvements do we see? Well, attention spans become longer. If it's become better selective in what they attend to, or I should say children, better able to plan and carry out systematic strategies for using their sense to achieve goals, and believed to be foundational to children's improvement in self-regulation. So in order to self-regulate, in order to inhibit, to accomplish whatever you need to do in a classroom setting, for example, you have to be able to pay attention. And if you can't pay attention, you're not going to be able to self-regulate, because every little distraction is going to distract you and you'll never be able to achieve whatever it is the goal in the classroom is, for example, for the day. Selective attention, the process of selecting one sensory channel and ignoring or minimizing others. So kind of straightforward. Involves deliberately concentrating on one thing while ignoring something else. It improves with age, and it depends on the complexity of the task. Children perform better with less distractions. Like a TV set with all channels switched on at once, children become hopelessly bewildered and distracted. 3.5 years olds have trouble completing tasks with any level of distraction, but you see improvement. And at 4 years old, have trouble with constant distractions. So it takes more distractions to prevent a child from paying attention, from trying to achieve whatever goal there is. And that's related to cognitive development. And so you can see kind of that association between attention and self-regulation. If you cannot pay attention with some noise going on in the background, then you won't be able to self-regulate behavior and then achieve whatever goal it is you're trying to achieve. Adolescent attention. Adolescents have longer attention spans than children. It's tied to increased myelination of these portions of the brain that help regulate attention. Again, a very common theme across development. Adolescents become better at switching attention from one task to another. They become more efficient at ignoring irrelevant information, which would interfere with learning. Can divide their attention more systematically between two tasks. They become better at multitasking. Improvements with age, but people overestimate their ability. Dividing attentional resources equal lower performance. So if X amount of attentional resources, when you divide them, you're going to perform worse. So right now, scrolling on Twitter, you're not taking in as much of this lecture as you would if you weren't scrolling on Twitter until hearing in adolescence. Exposure to loud sounds accumulated over time can lead to hearing loss. So I just wanted to highlight this point. Pretty much like everything else, things accumulate over time. Damage to damage to your ears accumulate over time, which can lead to long-term hearing issues. Hearing in adolescent, exposure to loud noises accumulate over time can lead to hearing loss as adults. So kind of a similar theme throughout development, that what you do accumulates over time, and in this case, loud noises, the accumulation of loud noises are harmful to long-term hearing ability. And then that table is just kind of a list of the decibel levels for certain sounds. You don't need to memorize or this or anything, but I just thought it was kind of cool. Adolescent taste and smell. Taste is influenced by past experience. Brightly colored juices are thought to be tastier than pale drinks, even if the two juices are actually identical. So an adult who has familiar drinking orange juice or whatever, does Tang still exist? So if you present them with a kind of duller colored orange juice, they will rate it as less tasty than the exact same drink, but just dyed more orange, for example. Both male and female adolescents report that odor is important in romantic partners, but they cannot define what a good or bad smelling person is. So it could have evolutionary benefits. So there's kind of just these ideas of that. You can imagine like thousands of years ago, someone having some kind of uh, gangrene or some kind of disease that smells, and that odor alerts the male or female that that person is probably going to die soon. So therefore, I'm not going to invest the resources into mating with that partner. Now, I've wanted to highlight some cross-cultural differences in attention and art. Cultural variations in analytic versus holistic thinkers. Analytic thinkers are thinkers who generally perceive the world as separate objects, versus kind of holistic thinkers who kind of emphasize the entire environment. Their tendency to view objects as bound to their backgrounds. So basically, the point of this task is to put a line inside of a box, and then you kind of rotate the box slash frame. And depending on the degree to which that you are rotating that frame, um, well, that variation, that change, that the movement of that frame impacts your ability to determine if that line right there is in a straight vertical line or if it's like tilted towards the same orientation of the box. So depending on where the degree to which that box is tilted, that degree of tilt of that box impacts your ability to perceive that that is a straight line or tilting towards the same direction that the box is tilted. And researchers look at the difference between analytic and holistic thinkers. Again, analytic thinkers generally perceive the world as separate objects and do well in this task because it's kind of straightforward, right? The line is different from the box, so you're going to do better on this task. However, holistic thinkers who show something called field dependence, the tendency to view objects bound to their backgrounds, perform worse on this versus analytic thinkers who use field independence thinking styles. So farmers who live in societies where they must coordinate their activities with others are more field dependent than hunter-gatherers or animal hoarders. So in this test, farmers would perform worse than hunter-gatherer societies. Religious training in Calvinism, which emphasizes the independence of individuals, leads people to be more field instinct than atheists or people with training in Catholicism or Judaism. And generally, people in industrialized societies tend to be quite field independent. That is, analytic thinkers, except for people living in highly industrialized East Asia, where clear evidence for field dependence is found. So we have some interesting cross-cultural findings with East Asian industrialized countries performing worse on this task, and with thus perform better on holistic thinking tasks than analytic thinkers, which is generally other industrialized non-East East Asian countries. Western artists tend to paint larger figures than Asian artists. A larger subject, particularly a large face, serves to focus the viewer's attention on the portrayed individual, dominates the scene and stands apart from the background. East Asian portraits, the subject remains firm within the surrounding context. So let's put this more in concrete terms. Americans and East Asian college students were asked to draw a landscape scene containing at least a house, a tree, and a river, and a person and a horizon for 5 minutes. The horizon level and background complexity was analyzed. East Asians drew a horizon that was much higher in the picture than the American drawings. East Asians tended to provide a more complex background by including 75% more contextual elements than the Americans, college students. East Asians were more likely than American college students to situate their objects in context. So you can see two examples here. So on the left, you can spoiler, that's the American college student drawing. And that's how I typically drew kind of these portraits reflecting my own cultural bias. Except I'm a horrible drawer, so I'm actually, it'd be far worse than this. And then on the right, you can see an East Asian college student, and where the individual here is much more difficult to see. It's in the background, but you can see a much larger house, kind of like trees to the left, a walkway, a larger horizon. And this gets back to just different ways of perceiving the world, literally. So kind of this holistic frame dependent view or kind of perception cognitive style of seeing the world versus a field independent and analytic approach and really focused on the individual within a Western context, in this case, American college students. And some studies have found this in Facebook too. So if you look at profile pictures, East Asian Facebook photos tend to have smaller figures and larger backgrounds compared to American ones. Again, kind of the focus on that individual American context. Moving on to adulteration. Sensory and perceptual capabilities decline gradually with age because of a rise in sensory threshold, that is the point at which low levels of stimulation can be detected. Sensitivity to very low levels of stimulation is lost. Declining perceptual abilities, even when stimulus is intense enough to be above threshold, older adults often have difficulty interpreting sensory information. They perform higher when the task is clear, not novel, and less distractors. So the idea with the sensory threshold is that, if I'm going to whisper this entire chapter, I'm going to whisper. Some people can hear that better than others, and that's reflected in one factor that contributes to some people being able to hear me weirdly whispering for 3 seconds is age. With older adults, less likely to be able to hear what I was saying. And they perform higher with tasks clear. So this kind of goes back to what we were saying before. It depends on the task. So if the task is clear, not novel, and they're used to it, so they know what to expect, they kind of can anticipate a little bit what the in this case auditory perception is going to be. They perform better on the task. Adult hearing. In older adults, hearing impairment is 3 times as prevalent as visual impairment. A majority of individuals older than 65 had at least mildly impaired hearing. Men are suspected to have more hearing loss, and that could be linked to the fact that men have historically been employed in noisier um, industrial jobs. So it could be a artifact of a particular cohort within a particular uh, economic and political context, a historical era. Hearing loss can lead to social isolation. So one of the downsides of hearing loss is if you can't hear anyone, maybe just give up with communicating with people. And that can lead to decreased mental health and other decreases in cognitive performance. Changes in soma aesthetic senses. Detection threshold for touch increases and sensitivity is gradually lost from childhood. Older people may be less sensitive to changes in temperature. This puts them at risk from death from heat waves due to less ability to maintain temperature equilibrium. In some instances, over 90% of excessive deaths during heat waves occurred in the elderly. During the 2003 Italian heat wave, the greatest increase of deaths were among the elderly. Average age of death from the 2021 summer wave in Oregon was 70. Age differences in pain thresholds are not large or consistent. So here we see that the deaths may be related to 2 issues. One, their inability to maintain like a equilibrium body temperature, and their decrease sensitivity to changes in temperature. And you know, in our current era where we're seeing increased heat waves due to climate change, older adults are more at risk. And we just saw this in the Oregon heat waves. It just happened alone. And preliminary data found that it was older adults who were impacted the most. And it's those who had no AC and had less resources. So again, the poor and elderly poor were most at risk in this moment of history. And pain thresholds are not large or consistent, however. And that's all. Thanks for everybody for watching, and I'll see you next week.